Hello and welcome to the Let's Get Mental podcast. I'm your host, Ollie, and today I'm joined by Bri
Yeah.
and Harry.
Hello, hello, hello.
So, to jump right in, today's topic is about mental health and trust. So, I thought we'd start off by just going around and sort of seeing what does trust mean to people in general. Harry, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Trust, trust for me, I think is about in terms of when you trust someone, whether it's family members, friends, and relationships, mental health services, any professionals. I think it's about feeling confident and feeling comfortable with someone enough to sort of not have to second guess anything you're saying or anything you're doing or anything you're feeling. It's sort of like that lack of filter, like you're able to just be yourself with that person. So if you trust someone with personal information, you are basically assuming that that person will do right by you. So to me, that's what trust in general means.
Nicely put. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Bri?
Yeah, I think the having confidence in somebody else is like a key point, but also like the feeling of security. So I guess kind of reiterating what Harry said, not having to second guess things. But also like having somebody who is dependable, will be there and will have your best interests at heart, and you don't even have to think about, what you're saying or what you're trusting them with, because the trust is just already there and they should have your best interests at heart and vice versa. Like it needs to be a two-way relationship as well.
Yeah, I think both summed it up really well there. Sort of you need the authenticity of knowing that it's not conditional, I guess the way to put it. It's you can be yourself and you won't lose this security, this bond that you've got with this person by acting in a way that they disagree with. It's sort of an unconditional supportive relationship. And I think I was nicely put by saying both ways, because it is almost like a sort of unspoken contract at the end of the day, because you generally can't have a trusting relationship one way if it doesn't go back the other. Because for me, at least, I don't think that would be an authentic, trusting relationship. And I think we've touched on it briefly as well. But if we've applied it generally as to sort of the definition of the word, what do we think it means in relation to mental health? So if I was looking at what would a trusting relationship be like between maybe a practitioner and so a service user, what might we say? Harry, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think trust in a working relationship between a service user and a professional mental health services is like the key to ensuring that the ongoing recovery journey is person centered. Because if that person does not trust who is working with them, they are going to be more likely to not open up to them, to not be honest about what's going on for them. I know personally from my own experience, I used to worry about telling someone if I'd like self-harmed, or if I'd worry like because I struggled with an eating disorder for several years. If I had like purposely not eaten or something during that week and I went to a session, I'd try and withhold that as much as I could, because I think when you've been through a lot, your trust is pretty battered and broken, and it doesn't matter how good that clinician is sat opposite you. It is almost against your like instincts to open up. And I think for a young person, especially going into mental health services, I'm sure it's the same for adults, where if you've never been involved in that sort of a therapy scenario, if you've never had that outlet before to bounce off your thoughts and challenge some of your thoughts, it's so foreign. It's so foreign. And going into that and being like, okay, here's a person sat opposite me who I know nothing about, and now I've got to tell them everything about myself. That takes a lot of trust. That is not an easy task. And my current role in my local CAMS is a peer support worker. So my role is basically using my experience to help those currently going through it engage in the service. And I get used in I was used in a fifth of all young people who came into our service last year, because that trust comes a lot quicker to me than it does other clinicians, where they feel like there's a power imbalance. Whereas when they're sat opposite someone like me who's been through it, it's almost like you have that shared language and that shared experience, and you almost go, oh, I trust you because you're already telling me, you know what I'm going to say, because you're saying things that I can relate to. So in terms of trust in a mental health context, it is so essential. And, you know, young people are very unlikely to sort of immediately speak up and say, oh, I don't trust this person who's working with me, or I don't think this is the right relationship. And again, that's where other roles like peer support workers or other clinicians are able to come in and sort of help with that process, because until that trust is there, there's sort of the journey doesn't really start. So it takes a lot, and it's about maintaining that and ongoing that, and making sure that that person feels protected. And it goes back to what Bri was saying earlier about the two-way street. Like, clinicians have to be honest with their young people about, okay, you can tell me that you've like self-harmed. I will have to note that down. I will have to like assess your risk. I will have to assess the intent of what you've done. I'll have to make sure that you're being safe and you're being clean and things like that. But having that open conversation instead of, you know, trying to reprimand them almost. And that doesn't happen a lot, but that is usually what is in that person's head of, I don't want to say something because I feel like they might have a go at me, or I feel like they might reprimand me.
Yeah.
So if that makes sense to people, Brian, I don't know if your experience has been similar, but I know for me that was sort of the way things were.
Yeah, I definitely agree with pretty much everything you've said there, and the fact that trust is like so essential in a young person's accessing mental health services and them getting a positive experience out of it. Like, as you say, if you don't trust the person you're working with, and trust, like I mentioned before, that they will have your best interests at heart, and that they're going to be open and honest with you, again, the two-way relationship, you you have to put your entire life at that moment in time, and everything, all your biggest fears, you're expected to share with this person. And you know, especially in mental health, it's their job to do it. So I think having trust in family and friends can be slightly different dynamic, because you're somehow related to them, or you know, they've got something invested in you as well. Whereas sometimes I think, I know when I first went into mental health services, I kind of was like, oh well, it's just their job. Like, they don't actually really care. They don't actually, like, why should I trust them? Because they have no real, they have nothing really to gain, whether they're, you know, good to me and whether they actually care about what I do and stuff. So yeah, I guess the trust and developing that trust is very different, but it's like possibly more important, because they are the people who can point you in the right directions and get you onto that road to recovery.
You know, when I turn friends onto therapy and or counseling services, even as adults, I often like sell it by saying it's good to have someone who has like no cards to play in your situation. They don't know you. There's no bias there. They, like, you could be as dramatic as you want. You could exaggerate the truth as much as you want. You could express how you feel and how intense things feel to you. I mean, it might be difficulties in relationships, it might be difficulties with your family, and you could just go off about your family. You could go off about your friends. You could go off about your partner to someone who doesn't know you because they've got no stakes in it, you know. So in some aspects it could be easier to trust someone like that because you know they've got nothing to play. But I think from my experience, because I came in at a difficult point where I'd struggled for so many years before even talking to anyone, that trust was not there. And I think a big tip that I've always asked clinicians to sort of carry in their work is to ask specifically young people direct questions. I know for me, there was a lot of times before I got support where I thought if someone just outrightly directly asked me a question like, how are you doing? How are things at school? How do you feel about yourself? Is there anything you're struggling with? I thought, then I'll speak up. But until that moment, I don't trust anyone. No one's given me a reason to trust them. So why would I say anything? You know, so it could go either way. And I think it's probably sometimes easier when it's lower intense mental health presentations. But everyone's different, you know, and these are just our experiences and experiences of people that we know. So I don't want to blanket statement things, but I trust, like Bryce said, is just essential.
Definitely. And I think you've both touched on it in a way. which is sort of touching on the aspect of patient-centered care. And I guess that's what we're all here for with the young advisors, is trying to ensure that for young people, they're not being worked on, they're being worked with. And I think Bri was saying about how when she'd access services, she was there like, well, it's just their jobs, they don't actually care about me. And that, why it's so important, I guess, with trust is to not look at it as maybe something on a tick box list of how to be a good practitioner, but it's to try and assess it and understanding that it can be relative and dynamic to each person that you work with. And that for some people, you mentioned that direct questions would be really helpful to establish this trusting relationship and creating this environment where you feel that they want to get invested in you, they have stakes in your situation and what you're going through. Whereas maybe for someone else, it might be something else that establishes this dynamic of trust and this transparency. Well, you mentioned about potentially how, depending on what level of severity someone has come to with their mental health or mental illness, to see a practitioner, because perhaps if it's something low level, I guess it all links into stigma. You might potentially feel a greater deal of stigma if it's something that you see as more shameful, if it's built up, if you feel that you can't manage it. Maybe there's an aspect of not wanting to trust in because you feel embarrassed by it, or you feel that you've done something wrong, which is of course not the case in any way, shape or form. But it's really interesting to sort of try and dissect into what it really means to trust someone in a mental health situation. And to turn the topic slightly, but to stay around trust, another key element of trust is sort of trusts themselves, sort of the organisational aspect of mental health services or healthcare services in general. And whilst I'm not going to sort of dive into this too much, I thought it could be helpful to just sort of touch on the wider picture and then dive in a bit more into the importance of trust within mental health work. So from the NHS Black Countries definition, they've said that a mental health trust provides treatment, care and advice to people who have mental health problems. The services may be provided from a hospital or in the community. So just for a big sort of general definition for it there, trust means nothing too much more, I guess, in this setting of more just being sort of a care provider. And it's just sort of the terminology that is being used. And there are slight differences between some trusts, between foundation trusts and sort of general trusts. Foundation trusts, I think, came about in the early 2000s. And the idea was to try and offer more autonomy to service providers if they were sort of really doing well, if they were exceeding sort of the targets that they needed to meet, and to sort of give them this extra autonomy so that they can provide the better care that they know would suit their locality better. So that's just sort of covering what it is in general. If anyone was curious whenever they've used a mental health service, or if in general you've gone along to one and see that it's under the remit of a trust. Some of these might not be a mental health trust. You can have it where, for example, if it's a young person service, you might have it as young people's services. It might be a young people's trust. But these are some of the general categories that come under, but there's nothing too much to worry about beyond this. So to dive back sort of onto the ground, as it were, the next question I've got down here is, why is trust important in mental health work? And I think we've touched on it quite a bit in general, but did anyone have anything they wanted to add potentially around confidentiality, or maybe looking a bit more around sort of the power dynamics that can come into play around young people with older practitioners? I don't know if Harry, you wanted to say anything about either of those?
Yeah, I mean, for me, as someone who works in mental health services, and I work with children and young people across the board, there is no one area that I go into. We work on the Thrive model, which is somewhat new and somewhat recent, and is slowly being spread around the country, where it's not only like the intense therapies delivered and the sort of higher risk cases, it's also like preventative work, and we run low mood groups and anxiety groups, and like I've worked with children from the age of 5 to 18, and the role that I do as a peer support worker, as this was like a brand new role in services, there was no blueprint, there was no way about how to make sure that the power dynamic that is there for whether we like it or not, with practitioners like normal therapists and service users versus a peer support worker, because my whole role is about being able to relate to them and share my experience. I had to sort of come up with my own way of what I thought would be best based on my own experience. Like, how would I want someone in that role to work with me? And I knew for me a massive thing was like, I hated working with therapists or practitioners who would continuously like write notes as I'm talking. It'd freak me out. It'd really make me overthink. It'd really set my anxiety off. But also, because I have anxiety, I wouldn't say anything about it. You know, I was very passive to it and sort of like allowed it to happen. So I made a conscious choice that every first session I go into with a new young person, I describe my role, I give a bit of backstory, and then I, from the get, have the safeguarding and confidentiality talk with them about, just because my role isn't like, I'm not a clinically trained professional in the sense that I don't have a degree in psychology, I don't have a degree in counseling. Like, my experience is what I'm an expert in. So just because all that is who I am, I still do this. I still follow the trust policies. And so I can say, you can tell me whatever you want, but if you say things where I think you're at risk or someone else is at risk, then this process will happen, you know, just so that it's crystal clear with them, we're open. But then after that, I don't take notes in my sessions with young people unless there's something that is safeguarded or safeguarding or risk related. And then I'll say, do you mind if I write this down? I need to get your exact words. Because when you write notes up as a professional, the idea is not to write everything that happened in the session. It's to write like the key points, what you worked on, what you've sort of themes you've discussed. But then if it comes to something that's risky, you have to write as much of it in quotation marks, like word for word from that person. So I made a conscious choice in order to try and keep that power imbalance at bay, to just spend the time connecting with that young person and making eye contact and that non-verbal communication that I think is so important between a clinician and a service user. So I know it's very unconventional and not everyone works that way, but for me, it has really helped me, I think, and it's really helped the young people I work with create that strong relationship quicker, because they can see that all I'm doing is listening to them and responding to them and acknowledging and validating what they're saying. You know, there's no, oh, let me write that down, or I'm going to make a note about that because you mentioned that. Like, I can remember what I said 10 minutes ago. You know, that's not a problem. I leave the session and write the notes up. So in terms of power imbalances and things, I know for me that was a big thing where I really didn't like people writing notes in front of me. I didn't like people trying to, if I was saying how I was feeling, go, oh, so what you're saying is, and then they'd sort of condense it. I don't know if Bry's ever had that experience. It happened to me all the time when I was in inpatient services, where my words would sort of almost get like filtered, or they'd get slightly changed just to sort of fit some sort of a model. And when you're the other side of it, when you're the service user, you have no idea what they're actually doing. You don't know why they're trying to condense your words or get you to say certain things, or like I had to say out loud several times, like, I'm not at risk, and I didn't even know what really that meant. When things are so in the moment for you, and you take it days it comes. So power imbalance is a major thing that I try and combat, and I really try and fight for young people to be seen as people still. You know, just because they're under the age of 18 doesn't mean they're like less clued up or less aware of how services are ran, or less aware of how they deserve to be treated, you know. And especially when we work with vulnerable young people who've come from really difficult environments and backgrounds, they deserve to feel like they're being listened to 100%. And I think that when they hear that and they feel that and they see that, is more important to me than making sure I've written down every single word they've said, when not all of it's relevant. You know, I don't have to write everything up about everything they've said, because those conversations are between us. And unless they want it being passed on to another clinician, or if it's being safeguarded, it doesn't need to get passed on, because that's the relationship we have. You know, it is that trust, and it's me and you talking now, you know, and let's work on those things. So I don't know if Bry's had any of those experiences. I know we've got like quite mirrored experiences in mental health services, so I'll be interested to know.
Yeah, so I think everything you kind of said there. It's just got my brain juices flowing.
Sorry, I talk a lot. I apologize to everyone listening to this podcast.
It's fine. I was just trying to remember everything that I wanted to say.
Hey, I gave you like 4 episodes before I came on, or 3 episodes, or whatever it was. So, you stuck with me now. Sorry.
So I think everything, especially with regards to confidentiality and like trust in mental health relationships, comes down to that idea of power. So like confidentiality is that the mental health professional has a power to, take things outside of the room. And like you say, making notes, that's the mental health professional having that power to put your words onto a piece of paper. And it's so important that power is like communicated and acknowledged, but not in a way that's making you feel that they have power against you, if that makes
100%.
sense.
I don't know if you had the same thing, but I remember when I was referred to CAMS through my GP, and I genuinely was expecting like an old bald man in a white lab coat. I thought I was gonna have to go lay on a chaise long and like talk about my life like you see in the films. And I genuinely thought, if I say the wrong thing here, or I say how like low I actually am, that they are gonna write something down, and then this whole process will be set in effect, where I'll then just get taken away to hospital like immediately. Like that's how I thought it worked, because there was no education about how services work. So I thought, if I say the wrong thing here, this is gonna set off a chain reaction of events. And I still work with young people now who think that's happening. Like I will go in with that story and they laugh and they're like, oh yeah, that's what I was expecting. Like I don't know what that's about, where we think, I don't know if it's just a distrust of services in general, or a distrust in like health services in general, where you think, if I say this wrong word, they're going to diagnose me with something or put me on tablets or take me to an inpatient service. Did you ever have that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I kind of thought the same thing, especially because I was a emergency referral to CAMS because I was in A&E. So it was kind of a massive whirlwind. Nothing really got explained to me, like you say. Um, and it is just like, for me, that openness. So yeah, explaining what's going to happen to you and explaining, don't just say the word confidentiality, explain what that really means, explain what scenarios would cause for a break in confidentiality,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
what that would then lead to, like what you say you do. And I think so I had quite different experiences, I'd like to say. I had two, actually I had three, but I had two therapists in CAMS, who were both, I trusted them both, but in very, very different ways, because my first therapist would have the session, and then after the session, my mom would go in and talk to my therapist after for like 5 minutes with me not in the room. And when I discuss like afterwards with my mom, so I've had conversations since, and she never really told her anything. It was more my mom being able to unload whatever concerns she had, but that was never communicated to me. So in my sessions, I was always thinking, oh
This
well,
is
she's
going to get
just
passed back to my mom.
yeah, but it never did. And
Hmm.
I that's why it should have been communicated to me so much better, that whether she was breaking confidentiality, what that was all about. And as you say, like I was really suffering with anxiety at the time, so I'd never asked those questions because
Yeah, no.
that wasn't my place. And then I
Yeah.
had another therapist who was, honestly, she was amazing. I will sing her praises forever. But she was so open about everything, like you say about the notes. She openly told me, she was like, I will have to write up notes about our sessions afterwards. She was like, but I will never put in any of my own opinion as such. She was
No,
like,
yeah.
the facts and then my professional kind of conclusion following that. But she was like, I would always tell you if there's anything important that I feel I need to put into those notes. And she was like, just yeah, really being open and honest with me about everything involved in that. Whereas with my previous therapist, I didn't even know that she made notes, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, but I do think I was younger for my first therapist, so I guess maybe there's different ways to approach it with age. And then, like you say, going back to my inpatient experience with this was actually a psychiatrist rather than like a psychotherapist or whatever. And I don't know what it is, but I think because they come at it from more of a doctor point of view. But the whole note taking thing happened. The whole reinforcing their power happens. So, if you'd say something like, well, I don't want to be here, and they're like, because at this point I was in an informal patient, so I wasn't under a section, I was technically there like through my own choice. If ever I said anything about leaving, they would, bring up oh, well, we could always reinforce that you stay through other means, basically implying that a section could be used. And it was that very mad power dynamic that went on there. I think inpatients have a lot more to work on with regards to trust, because there's also such a different dynamic in an inpatient.
Oh, that's a whole, we could do a whole podcast on inpatient services, to be honest.
That's an idea.
Yeah.
You both brought up some really interesting points with that, and I think it's interesting to hear how you've mentioned sort of like the differences of like inpatient and not necessarily outpatient, but maybe like CAMS services, for example, and sort of like the different dimensions you're bringing into that. I think a clear theme that's come along is definitely sort of transparency in communication, and I guess with that, going back to working with us, not working on us. And it's that really difficult balance of trying to establish power to support and trying to look out for someone's best interest in the most participatory way possible. Because by the sounds of it, what they were saying to you, Bri, that probably wouldn't have made you feel particularly like you wanted to trust the services if you feel almost like you're being threatened with what powers they have over you. So it was really interesting to hear you bring that up. And I thought from this, we could potentially try and just sort of bullet point out maybe from the process of accessing a mental health service. I think we've touched on practitioners a lot, but if there's any final points, and then sort of within the wider mental health system, sort of from start to finish, that what sort of elements of trust come into it. So I know we've said with practitioners, maybe it's making sure that you're being yourself. You're not trying to, like Harry was saying, he introduced his way of doing it. It wasn't trying to just read off. Obviously, I know it's a different role, so it's a different situation to all, but it's making sure that you bring your own aspect to it. You don't try and put on a persona that's just trying to fit a criteria. You're remaining, it's a person-to-person connection. Maybe that's a big element of why trust is important in practitioners. But going back a step to, if you're accessing a mental health service, what ways do we think that trust can affect this? Bride, do you want to start?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute my mic then.
Don't worry.
Yeah, I think the trust, like we kind of touched on earlier, the trust of the service as a whole and what you're expecting from that service comes into play there. So when me and Harry both mentioned that we thought it was going to be, this sitting on a sofa while somebody there with a white lab coat tells you, and this, I think the word confidentiality is brought up a lot, like before you're even in a mental health service, they have to reinforce that, the confidentiality, and that word is such a scary word. So in terms of trust, with accessing a mental health service, you have to trust that service is going to be what you need at that moment in time. Otherwise, you simply will just not engage or not even, turn up to that first appointment in the right mindset. And you also need to trust kind of the process, I think, maybe. That's how I'd word it. Like, yeah, trust the process, that it's not going to be some crazy mad thing, and that you are going to be able to get somewhere from it. You're not going to end up, in a hospital bed being injected with different things. You are going to, get good, well, hopefully in most cases, you are going to get some sort of good relationship with a therapist or somebody who can help you, who can then, eventually, hopefully discharge you from mental health services. I think that's kind of how I'd go about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from saying like that, it's these key points of keeping it open, educating people, and empowering the individual. I think that's definitely a big point in this, in accessing services, people going in having no idea of what's really going on. And that's not really an equal playing field if you've got someone who's fully qualified. Because obviously, you're not expecting it to be that every single patient is going to come in knowing exactly how everything's going to go. but making them feel that they're aware of sort of the decision-making process that they have, maybe that they're aware that, no, these are all just sort of myths that have happened, and trying to sort of ease people in by not just saying, well, this is what we know you need, but helping them to understand that by accessing a service, it is going to be something that supports them and making them want to access it rather than being told that they have to access it. I don't know what your thoughts are around accessing services and trust, Harry.
I think for me, I just have this like really vivid memory of any time I'd go into a new service, like especially when you transition out of CAMS when you're 18, or you go into an inpatient service, or if you later access support later in life. When you have had previous experience of mental health services, it's I feel like the power imbalance feels a bit stronger the more you stay in services, because the more talks that you have around like policies and if you do this, this will happen. If you do that, that'll happen. Makes you feel like more of a problem, if that makes any sense. It did to me anyway, where Bryce like briefly touched on it before, where it almost feels like a weird threat. Like I had the same experience in inpatient where I wanted to leave, and because they didn't know what was going on with me. I mean, the people who did my discharge review was a school teacher and an assistant. It wasn't anyone who had anything to do with my care. And because they weren't clued up and they didn't know what was going on, they then started talking about sections. And it is the one time that I've walked out of a session because it just felt like the last person that they were thinking about was me. And, you are trusting them with your life, really, especially in a scenario like inpatient where you feel like there is no other option but to be in a place like that, or that option's been taken out of your control and you have to be there for your own safety. So to be in a setting like that where these things start, it's almost like breaking the fourth wall, or it's like in the Wizard of Oz where you see like the man behind the curtain. It's when you see like a service user should never see the inner workings of a service. I mean, there's been times where I've been on the staff member side of different services that I've worked in and sort of had to fight the corner of the patient, because things will come up about waiting times and waiting lists, and there's pressures on services for that, and it all goes back to funding. And well, if we can't get through this many young people, we can't have a young person waiting for 8 weeks, like let's put them in a group. So, but it's not necessarily benefiting a young person. I think in order to keep it person-centered, you have to treat every new person who comes into service, if you're one of the clinicians, as a completely separate case. Which, I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's not always the way that things go. You have to start from the beginning and make your own judgment as to what is the best way to work with this young person. Let me ask them what they want. How do they feel? Some people for their own anxiety would like to know the inner workings, and so what happens if I say this then? Give them that space to question the inner workings of it, because it's so abnormal to them to be in a scenario like this when they first come in, and it's not normal to sit and talk about your feelings to everyone. That doesn't feel normal to everyone, and not everyone has had the benefit of, being around supportive people. So they might have questions, and it's not a one size fits all approach. So I don't really know if that answers your question, but that's just what came to my forefront, was following up on what Bryce said, is that it makes a huge difference when you are on the receiving end of talks about confidentiality. If it's being repeated a lot, if, like for me, because I was anorexic and had bulimic tendencies, every time that my weight sort of went down, even if it was like by 0.2 of a kilogram, the conversation to be had again about inpatient. And even after inpatient, it was, well, you don't want to go back to inpatient. So there's that whole pressure in a way. And I don't know if it's frustration about the clinicians having to work with me for so long, or, they don't keep people for this long in services normally. Like, you're supposed to be better because you've been to inpatient, so you don't really want to go back there. So if we say that, then we know that you'll put weight on. But that isn't progressive recovery. That's doing something to benefit someone else. And then the second that that person isn't being watched, I know for me, it was like, well, if I'm not being weighed anymore, then I can lose as much weight as I want. So I don't really know how helpful that is. It's just making sure you're very aware of the choices of words that you're using with young people, because they pick up on everything. And I think sometimes that gets overlooked.
Definitely. And I think you linked it back nicely to sort of concluding this section of sort of like trust within the wider mental health system. And I think here we can see how especially important it is, and to sort of follow through on this trust, that it isn't something that you promise and then fail to come through with, is to be aware of, I guess, the external pressures on services, because obviously they are there with funding, sort of like progress markers, key performance indicators that they're being told that they have to meet to be a good service. But at the end of the day, if you're not meeting these in a way that's genuine and in a way that's actually ensuring that the young person has been treated in a way that's beneficial to them, it isn't just, okay, well, like you said, for you, being almost like threatened by the prospect of going in to sort of almost use it as a deterrent to like, okay, well, this person has been treated in this amount of time, therefore we deserve our gold star. But being aware that if it isn't working, and if not every single patient will pass through in the average amount of time for it, some will need that extra support, and that's their care journey. And that it's your duty to think, okay, well, we can learn something from this, and maybe in understanding how this journey was different from this person, we've got a new skill set that might make it easier for us to give this another person who comes in with a more similar situation, how we can make sure that their needs are met more quickly, because we understand where they're coming from a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, we're not saying all this to undermine the pressures that are on services, because trust me, I've been in those conversations, and there is so much pressure to get through as many people as you can, as quickly as you can, and sort of like fix everyone. Whereas every single person who I can say hand on heart who works in the service that I work with, are all there for the right reasons. No one's there to fast track anyone. Everyone's there to help people. And sometimes it feels like it goes out of their control as to how much work they can do with someone, because the demand is so high. You know, you just have a look at the world and the state that we're in now, in just as the human race. You know, we have never had well, in my lifetime, in this generation, we haven't had pressures and environmental factors such as politics, the global pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, LGBTQ plus rights. All these conversations are happening at once, and there has never been so much confusion and stress and pressure on people. So it's no wonder why the mental health services are under so much pressure and stress.
Yeah.
But the answer to that isn't to just quickly see people and shove everyone into a one-size-fits-all sort of treatment package and almost try and convince that person that that is the right way to go about things, because everyone should still have the right to their own choice of care and how they get looked after. So we're not undermining it, and we understand what's going on, because there is so much pressure. And I've been there, I've been in those meetings, I've seen the stress that clinicians are put under, but we have to keep in mind the reason that everyone's doing the job that they're doing. It's to help people. So it's okay, we've only got this much time to work with this person. What about if we open up these options more, and let's have a look at what we could do in that time? Let's talk to the young person about, so we could do this, this, and this, and this. What do you think? As opposed to, let's just decide without them, you know?
Definitely. And hopefully what we're looking for here, if we're really making sure to keep it person-centered in this journey of care, is hopefully more long-term solutions. Because I know definitely, myself included, and some other people that I know who've accessed services, they've been put in with a very short time frame, maybe something like, here's how much time you're allocated up front. And it's sort of a situation where you'll go in, not be listened to, and then be given a conclusion to the sort of your treatment, which hasn't really resolved anything. So all it means is you're just straight back on that waiting list, and then having to go through it again later, or maybe you won't jump back on. And then when you do access it, it'll end up being more severe. So I think it's trying to look towards those long-term goals. And I guess like we're saying, we're not putting any, I don't know, it's not sort of the whip against any of the practitioners, because like you said, the people who are doing this work are incredible. And the people who are going into this, fingers crossed, are the people who are genuinely here to make a difference and believe in all of this. But I guess it's also important to sort of, for young people out there who might be listening, who are going through their own journey of care, to know that they have the rights to stick up for this. And if they feel that it isn't going right for them, it's not going how they think, sometimes that could just be a misunderstanding, and that you're completely within your rights to turn around and say, okay, well, I know you are taking us down route A, and I think you have got the wrong impression here, because for me, I think it would be a lot more helpful if we tried this. And obviously, those situations where you have enough knowledge to understand to say, no, I don't like this, yes, we'll do this, aren't always there. But maybe it's just the start of being able to say, actually, this isn't working. How can we work together to find something that's going to be mutually beneficial? So moving forward from this, we've spoken about sort of our experiences and sort of how it's gone well, how it's gone wrong, what trust entails. But if we're going to look at what do good trusting relationships look like, what do untrusting relationships look like? Bryony, did you want to start and just maybe say some, I guess, key elements to someone's personality or a dynamic that's a good trusting relationship or a bad relationship where trust isn't there? What sort of things would you recommend for practitioners to avoid or to follow?
So personally, one thing that I found through my own experience is like bringing their own personality and their own, like bringing themselves to the session so that they seem like they are, they're in the moment with you, and they are really honestly, openly wanting to know about you. And one trick that my second therapist did was, a lot of the time she'd find like common ground. So we both, she established, I think, in the first session that we both had a real interest in horses. So that was a common ground that, even if until that trust was not fully developed, there was something that we could both talk about and both feel that we had some sort of connection over. So, and she'd often relate that to mental health and, discuss horses in relation to mental health and things like that, which may seem crazy to other people, but we knew what was going on. And then it almost created this little bubble that we had together. And that, I think, encouraged that trust to form, because, she was being really open and honest with me, and I was doing the same to her, but not in a way that felt very focused on my mental health. I think an untrusting relationship, I'd say the main thing for a lack of trust in a relationship would be a lack of clarity. How can you trust somebody if you don't know entirely what's going on? And how can you expect them to trust what you're saying if, again, they're not putting the effort in to explain everything to you? So yeah.
Definitely. And I think it's come up again with this sort of reciprocal, authentic relationship. And I know I've had times where I've been in services where someone quite, I know, I hate to use the word cringe, but has sort of tried to take on this persona and of being sort of young and hip and sort of like, yeah, I'm not like other therapists, which sounds a bit ridiculous, especially considering this person was probably in their 50s at this point, and I was in my late teens, early 20s. To try and connect with someone in that way seems a bit old school, I guess, in trying to create this trust, to try and force the dynamic, I guess. So hearing how you were able to find this common ground and using that to build on is really refreshing to hear. And it's a really interesting technique that I hadn't thought about. I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that, Harry.
Well, I'm not a regular therapist. I'm a call therapist. That's what I wanted to add into the conversation. I just had like the vivid image of the mum from Mean Girls as soon as you started speaking. But in terms of good, in terms of good and not so good trustworthy relationships and examples of that. I mean, in CAMS, I had 3 separate therapists, and that was because the first one who I worked with, she ended up getting pregnant and she left, and then the second one ended up getting pregnant and then she left, and then the third one got pregnant and then she was leaving as I was leaving. I was convinced that it was a conspiracy, that the only way that they could get rid of me was to have a child and go on maternity leave. Obviously not the case, but they all had very different approaches. I remember Sally, the first person who I worked with, she was very nurturing, very calm, very not maternal, but almost like a big sister. And she was like the first person who genuinely ever told me like that things that I'd gone through was wrong, like trauma that I'd been through. She said that was wrong and that shouldn't have happened to you. And it was like this Pandora box effect where it was the first time that someone had actually started delving into things that had gone on with me. And because so much had happened in such little time at that point in my life, that I think her approach of being gentle and being calm really worked for me. And then Laura, who I actually still work with and I'm now good friends, who was a therapist of mine, for the main bulk really of my time in service, she came in just after I'd sort of come out of inpatient. And at first, she scared the living daylights out of me because she was so dramatically different from Sally. And she was very like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. Like, if you don't want help, that's fine. We won't help you. And she was basically talking directly to my eating disorder. And it scared the living daylights out of my eating disorder because it was like, oh, so what? It was really a shock to the system. But everything she was saying, she was like spot on about. And it was something that I, myself, Harry, had never. It sort of gave me the chance to speak up over my eating disorder and go, do you know what? We're not going to lie. We need to speak up and say that we're not okay, or we need to really try that. We need to really get out of this because there's like no time like the present. We need to focus on this. We need to start moving things forward. And her approach, I genuinely think it saved my life because it gave me my own voice back as opposed to just focusing on the trauma, just focusing on what the eating disorder wanted to do and allowing the eating disorder to manipulate therapists and get out of situations and get out of being weighed. She wasn't letting any of it fly. But what she'd also do is tell me about her own experiences in life in general, her struggles. And I've trusted her with everything, and I engaged in trauma therapy with her in EMDR, which, if people don't know, is a really intense trauma therapy where you basically relive the trauma and reprocess it so that you can sort of have it out of your forefront and the triggers don't bother you as much. It's really effective, but it's a very difficult and exhausting process. And I went through all that with her. I dissociated from 2 of the sessions, and when I'd come back the next week and I didn't even know what she was talking about, like what session she was talking about, she very quickly helped me explain what was going on for me then. She was explaining that I dissociated, and she was very honest with me, and was very mindful about the fact that I can't be in services forever. And if I wanted to continue with all these plans I had for my life of finishing school, going to college, going to university, getting a job, having friends, having a relationship at some point, all these things that I wanted to do. She said, if you need to do all these, I need you to know, if all confidence in yourself, that you can maintain these skills and maintain these practices. So what are you messing about with, basically? Like, why are you wasting time by not practicing things that we've set to do this week? You need to start doing that. And I really appreciated that relationship. And I still call her up now and she calls me up now. We have this mutuality and this reciprocal, what's the word? Reciprocity? I can see the word in my head and I can't pronounce it.
Are you on about reciprocity?
That's the one. Thank you, Bryony, psychology student over there. Yeah. Yeah, thank God she's been paying attention in her lectures. But yeah, no, so that we have that relationship now and we're just friends now, and it's really nice to have someone like that. In terms of bad relationships, I wouldn't say, well, do you know what? Who cares? It was bad. It was mainly most of the relationships I had in inpatient with the staff, and apart from one, a woman called Liz who really fought my corner, and she just unfortunately wasn't working the day that all these decisions were being made, and she really championed my rights and she championed my decisions and the way that I thought, and she completely understood that, okay, I'm not at an ideal weight, I'm still completely underweight and I'm still self-harming, but I need to get out of here. I need to finish my GCSEs. That to me is more important right now. So not let this chapter of my life be defined by the fact I was in hospital. I need to get out and close this chapter myself. She was all there for me, whereas every I want to say every other staff member, apart from maybe another one, treated me like just another patient. It was another caseload. It was another number. It was, you're this number because you weigh this much. Things were said to me like, we're not as worried about you because you're not as skinny as the girls. I mean, you've got to remember, I was a 6'2", 16-year-old male with an eating disorder, from a tiny town who didn't know anyone. I was quite an anomaly in terms of mental health services. So I don't know if they didn't know what to do with me, so they tried to put me into a box. But I don't know why you'd say to anyone with an eating disorder, you're not as skinny as someone else. Like, it was just like there was just absolutely no thought at all for their consideration of their words, or the fact you're comparing me to people whose bodies are completely different to mine, like just in all aspects, just completely different bodies. I had male staff members questioning my sexuality in conversations. I overheard them as to whether it was appropriate for them to weigh me because I had to be weighed in my underwear, and I overheard all that. And then they'd come in and smile and do their job and be like, you know, you can always talk to us if you want to. It's like, why would I trust anything that you're saying when I've just heard how you actually talk about me? And it just set paranoia off, and it just created this complete lack of trust. And then I came out and obviously met Laura, and it took a long time to build that trust up, but I think her sharp turn in approach really did help. So I think the lesson from that I've learned is that, you know, sometimes one approach is good for a certain amount of time and for a certain reason, and it gives a certain purpose. But then if things need to be changed up, if that recovery isn't moving on, or if that that mental illness, that voice of the mental illness is getting comfortable and is able to have a bit of leeway, it will use that, you know. And sometimes you need that person to opposite you going, what are you playing at, to really scare the depression or the self-harm or the eating disorder out of hiding in the shadows. You know, you sometimes need to get a reaction out of that person to challenge it and to get to the core value of, okay, so why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And then that thing will give you its reason of, well, if I don't have control, then what do I have? And they'll go, oh, okay, well, there's the problem. Like, we need to work on that then. Or if it's about an eating disorder, if it was weight, it was, so why did you miss meals? Like, what you can't be ill every other week. What's your reasoning? And it was this fear of gaining weight. And so then we was able to talk about that. And if I wasn't able to open up to anyone, it was because of trauma in my past. So then we did trauma work. You know, there was sometimes those leading questions, like I mentioned earlier, can lead to the core values and the core problems a lot quicker of a person, because we don't know what all this mess is in our head. Like, I don't know if that's an assumption that some clinicians had, where they think young people come into services and know what they want to work on, but that isn't true. I've never come across a young person who's like, hi, so I've got a plan, I want to work on this, this, and this, and this. Like, they know what bothers them, but part of the job is to sort of delve in. And if you don't have that trust there, then there's not a chance that that's going to happen.
Exactly. And I think part of that trust is that you're putting faith in the person who knows a bit more about stuff like this, and that they can then do what you can't, like you were just saying.
Yeah, absolutely. What my pet peeve, I don't know if Bry's had the same thing or if you've had the same thing, where a professional sort of asks me what I want to work on.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, I don't know. I just know
Everything.
I'm not right. Yeah, I'm like, life. And it's like, I don't know if this is like a really British thing where it's like, how are you? And you go, fine. Like, regardless, like, I could literally be bleeding to death or have just been hit by a bus, and I'm like, I'm fine. Like, you know, I don't know if that's just like a cultural thing that we all do. So it's like, why are you even asking those questions? Like, what do you think I'm going to say? Like, what do you want to work on? It's like, well, I'd actually like to do some CBT work on anxiety. And if we could use, you know, the bucket filling method and analogy, that'd be really useful. Like, why would a 14-year-old come out with that? Like, that's just not going to happen. Yeah, I just think it's talking to people like people. I know I've said it for years, but my God, it makes a difference.
Literally. That
It
is
is.
as simple as it is.
It is. And I think as well, sometimes I know that I've had it where we've sort of spoken about stuff, or I will have, not to use the term self-diagnosed, but maybe I've become aware of something and I'm like, oh, well, I want to speak to someone who can advise me, who can support me through this. And then whenever I try to then bring that up, almost in the complete opposite of the situation of not knowing what to go down, and trying to bring it up, and then them sort of completely derailing it down someone else to try and squeeze you into that. Oh yeah, but I want to tackle this. And I know you said that, and I know you opened up about that, but I actually think that, and shutting it down straight away. And it's sort of there like, well, of course, you're there to see the specialist, and it might be not everyone is going to be able to just sit there and think, oh yes, well, I've had this experience, and then they might start thinking that it might affect them in this way, and maybe that's not correct. Maybe it's symptomatic of something else. But to shut it down so quickly and to just say, no, it's this, no, it's that, especially when at the end of the day, it's surprising how well self-awareness, how far it can get you towards sort of finding out the general area of the issue. So it's like the complete opposite, I guess, in that respect, of if someone then does have something to bring up, that you'll trust them and let them go into it. And maybe that's all they need. Maybe it's just a chance to speak about this whole experience and let someone else hear it. And maybe that, even if it turns out maybe they were worried about, oh, maybe I'm starting to develop anxious tendencies, and maybe they can say, oh no, actually that's completely normal for that. But being given that sort of, not validation, but that sort of second opinion from someone who you're going to be trusting so much, can offer just as much support than if you do have something that then you need to go down an avenue of care, if that makes sense. But I think we've done very well to cover quite a lot of things today, and I'm aware sort of time-wise. So I'm just thinking we'll wrap it up now. And I'll just say, so if everyone liked today's podcast, wants to know any more, if there are any things that stuck out to you that you're like, oh, I want to hear more about that, or any questions you have, feel free to contact us through our Young Advisor email, or through any of our social media channels, which is at CYPIAPS midYA for Twitter, or Midlands_YA for Instagram. Or you can follow on the website of www.associatedevelopmentsolutions.com/Midlands Young Advisors hyphenated, if you want to find out more about our work or get us involved in any of your service. But before we end here, I thought it could be a nice way to round off of just saying, if you could give one top tip to either a young person or a practitioner in terms of the importance of trust in mental health services, what would you say? Harry, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of a young person, I know this is something that I'm working on at the minute, and it's just being present. I know there is often a lot of conversations and themes talk about mindfulness, and it can all seem a bit abstract, but if you apply it to the actual core principle of it, it is about being present. I know for myself, when you've been through a lot, it's very difficult to stop thinking that and stop repeating history and stop falling into negative coping strategies and things like that. But if you take each day as it comes, try meditation in the morning, or just try have an hour to yourself in the morning before you have to do anything, where you are just starting the day as a brand new day, then just do that. Just be. If you're feeling sad, acknowledge it and think of things that you can do to help yourself. It doesn't mean push it away. And try and talk to someone. If your trust isn't there, find a way that if you can speak to someone who you don't know, like a therapist, or like Childline, or like local services like Couth, or Young Minds, other options where you can talk to someone that you don't really need to have to trust them because they don't know you. Do that. In terms of clinicians, I guess the theme which I've said earlier and Bryce echoed is, treating people like people, like treat these service users as they are, as you would want to be treated, as you'd want a family member to be treated. Give them time, try different ways, and see what they want to work on and go forward with that. And if you feel like you could challenge them on something, do it cautiously, but don't feel afraid to ask direct questions. So they're my 2 tips. But yeah, thanks.
Nicely put. Brian, did you have any thoughts? What would your top tip be?
Mine would be kind of that honesty. I feel like trust can't be built without honesty. And there's a nice little quote that says, "Trust is an emotional brain state, not just an expectation of behaviour." Which I think really is really nice, because it kind of reinforces that you need to get that person to trust you in every sense of the word, and to really feel that right down to their core before you can get anywhere. It can't just be you doing a couple of actions, tick box things, telling them about confidentiality, blah blah blah. That's not how it works. So yeah, just being really open and honest, and making sure that you are doing as much as you can for that person to feel comfortable and secure in your care.
Definitely. Tip. And I guess mine, if I had to give one, would be one for both practitioners and people, service users, I guess, is sort of looking at the two-way aspect of trust. And that, as scary as it can seem, and as much of a free fall it can feel if you're a service user, especially for the first time, if you don't know what's going on. But if you can't, if you refuse to trust that service user, then how are they going to be able to sort of trust in you back? It's very much a two-way street for that. If you're going to have to trust that person and do everything you can to be honest and genuine about your experiences, however possible that is at the time, if you want them to be able to sort of trust in your answers and therefore be able to listen to what you have to say and follow it to give you the most appropriate route of care as possible. Hope that made sense. Thanks so much for everyone who's tuned in today. Hopefully you'll find it an interesting episode and we haven't rambled too much. Just sign off now and say bye-bye, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.